This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. Folks, we had a fortunate night to have for the second week in a row, Pol P Rawls, the famous, iconic Associated Press reporter in Alabama for 35 and a half years. Is such an interesting individual, knows so much Alabama politics, Alabama history, has covered it for so long, that I've asked him to come back for a second week because we only got to the tip of the iceberg last week when we were talking about Alabama politics and Alabama history. He's covered it, the Capitol, since 1977 and retired in 2015. Close to over 35, 36 years. He was with Associated Press 35 and a half years, and then had covered the Capitol for the Montgomery Advertiser for about 2 or 3 years prior to that. Phil and I are contemporaries. We both grew up in South Alabama, me and Troy, him in Andalusia, and we entered the University of Alabama as freshmen together in 1969 after graduating, him from Andalusia High School, me from Charles Henderson and Troy, and similar backgrounds. He majored in journalism, I majored in political science, and we became friends then, and we stayed friends through our life. And he knows so much Alabama history and Alabama politics, I wanted him on for a second week, almost similar to a lot of you viewers remembering Ed Bridges, who came on my show a year or two ago, and by popular demand, we wanted him back for a second week and then a third week, and he's a walking encyclopedia. But Phil's lived Alabama history. He, of course, as I said, has been with Associated Press, retired last year, enjoying his life in Pike Road, retired. Phil, last week we covered a lot of ground. We covered you and I growing up together and being in Alabama together, and you starting at the Capitol in the 70s, and then we covered some Wallace years. We covered the Speaker McCorkadell, Speaker Tom Drake, Wallace's first term, and then we got into the Guy Hunt thing, and we've got a lot of ground to cover. We got a lot of governors we ain't covered. All we covered was Wallace first term and Guy Hunt, but I skipped old Fob James. Let's go back to Guy Hunt. That was a poignant story you told about his daughter being mentally ill, and the Hunts were so out front with it, and they were good folks. And I tell you one story about, I've written this in my book and also in columns. We've had a lot of great first ladies, but Phil, I would contend that Helen Hunt was one of the finest first ladies the state of Alabama ever had. She was as sweet a lady as I've ever seen. She had a countenance about her that just exuded humbleness and a sweet Christian spirit. I'll tell you a story that exemplified that perfectly. Hunt was trying to take a page out of Wallace's playbook. You probably knew this by covering the Capitol. My first term from 82 to 86, when Wallace was in his last year, I was his representative and was one of his floor leaders as a freshman legislator from Pike and Barber County. And he would have us out at the governor's mansion. You may remember how every week, I think I may have eaten supper at the governor's mansion with Wallace more than I did at home one time. And he knew everything about you, everything about your district. And as you mentioned last week, the Republicans realized that they had opportunity to elect the governor, Guy Hunt, and they built a cabinet that you brought out very astutely was so superior that they told him, you need to cultivate legislators.
He would have legislators of both parties to the mansion regularly to to have dinner. Governor Hunt would. And one of the interesting stories that I would hear from legislators is often when they would go over, Mrs. Hunt would bake peach cobbler, and her peach cobbler became legendary among legislators. And she was very traditional. If someone was coming to your house, in the South, you baked something special. You had a special dessert that was your signature. And even though she was First Lady and had lots of help at the mansion, she maintained that tradition that I've got guests in my house, I'm going to bake something special for them. And once the, I don't remember the occasion, but once the governor had was having a news conference at the mansion instead of his office. And after the news conference was over, Mrs. Hunt brought out peach cobbler for the press corps. I'd never had that happen in a news conference before or since, but we were guests in her house, and she was, she felt like she was supposed to make guest welcome. And so I got to taste her legendary peach cobbler, but she was a very sweet lady. The state's daycare center downtown is named in her honor, and I thought that was it's owned by the state retirement systems, and I thought that was a very fitting tribute to her.
I like that peach cobbler story. She was so humble and sweet. The story I revealed is that Hunt was having us out there one night, and he's down at one end of the table, and she's down here, and I'm seated next to her. And I could tell from the conversation, this is the sweetest lady I've ever seen in my life. She just was so humble. And we got through with supper, and your mama may have done the same thing with you. My mom always trained me to tell whoever fixed your supper you enjoyed it.
Right.
Whether you did or not. You're supposed to say, well, and sure, thank you for a meal I enjoyed something. So I figured she being the hostess, I was supposed to thank Miss Hunt for enjoying my supper. And I got looking for it, and I asked several people. And as you know, being around the governor's mansion, they got about a dozen servants out there who are trustees from prison or whatever. One of them, old guy, had been there since Big Jim was there. And they said she's back in the kitchen. And I went back there to thank her, and I looked out there, and the poor little lady was so humble. She was so used to her little house at Holly Pond, she couldn't stand someone washing dishes or waiting on. She was back there washing dishes. That's how humble she was. And had 3 servants. That was their job, was to wash the dishes. And the first lady's back there washing dishes. That doesn't surprise you, does it?
No, not at all. She was that type of person. One of the sweetest and saddest moments I ever saw, after Governor Hunt had been convicted and removed from office, he had to move out of the mansion, and Lieutenant Governor Folsom had moved up to governor, but he gave Governor Hunt plenty of time to move out of the mansion. And it was moving day, and the Hunts were starting
You were covering it.
Yeah, the Hunts were starting to leave, and Governor Hunt got out of his vehicle, walked around to the backyard of the mansion where there's a rose garden, and he took out his pocket knife. He cut one red rose. He walked back around to the front, got in their vehicle, and handed it to Mrs. Hunt. He was saying goodbye to the mansion, to the governorship, to his place in history. And I thought, and he was thinking about her though, and that was one of the sweetest and saddest moments I ever covered.
You covered, that was a poignant moment, wasn't it? You know, Phil, we can sit here and reminisce about this stuff. You know, Hunt and Seagram, neither one, that wasn't justice for them to be convicted like that. You know, moving forward, you may think differently, but Seagram didn't do anything but raise money for a lottery. And he wasn't going to make a dime off that thing. Hunt didn't know he wasn't supposed to. I mean, what he did was not punishable by leaving. Do you think I'm right about that?
I would disagree with you on Seagram. I could argue the lottery contributions both ways, but I think on the obstruction of justice charge that he was convicted on, trying to hide the motorcycle that came from a lobbyist.
That one, yeah.
I don't think there's in any way. I think he was guilty on that. I don't think there was any way around it. He wouldn't have wound up with the long sentence he got if it were only that. But I don't think. I think he got scared on that motorcycle and tried to hide it. And I think even his strongest supporters don't make much of an argument on that one, that he goofed on that.
Phil, let me go back. It was something I missed last week that I want to go back to, and it really is historical. When you arrived in '77 to cover the Capitol, you were a young man in your 20s. There were some iconic, legendary political writers still covering the Capitol. Ted Bryant was one. Frank Brewer was one. Was Bob Ingram still covering the Capitol?
No, Bob had his magazine then. He was.
Who all was there?
Al Fox was there with the Birmingham.
Al Fox was still there.
And Al's son, Peck, later became one of Governor Jim Folsom Jr.'s top advisors. Rex Thomas had just retired with Associated. Well, Rex was still there when I started with the Advertiser in '77, but he retired about the time I started with AP in '79, and it was interesting. The press corps then was largely male, both, and there were a lot more TV stations that covered the Capitol then than now. The WBRC in
Birmingham just doesn't cover politics like they used to.
They had a bureau down here, and a lot of the smaller papers would send people down to Montgomery during the session. The Dothan Eagle, the Columbus Ledger Enquirer, a lot of papers had people down here during the session that they don't send anymore. Mobile stations were here regularly, so it was the media.
Birmingham and Mobile's television don't cover the Capitol much anymore.
Well, they get stuff from the Montgomery stations and re-air it, but the number of people, it's interesting, the number of people who were covering the legislature back then was much larger. The number of lobbyists was much smaller back then when I first started.
Right. Yeah, the press was more and the lobbyists was less. But tell me one thing you told me one time about Frank Brewer had some legendary tapes of Wallace's or transcripts. You were privy to seeing those of Wallace?
Frank transcribed a lot of the interviews he did and saved those. He had a long interview with one of Wallace's doctors right after Wallace was shot in Maryland. And, you know, people forget, but for the first few days, nobody really knew whether Wallace was going to make it or not. It was touch and go. And, but Frank saved everything, and after he passed away, I was able to give a lot of stuff that he had left in the State House press room to for others to use after he retired. Was able to give those to the state archives, so that
they were Bridges when I was still there.
Yeah, so they're over there. It was a great resource that needed to be preserved.
You and Ed are real resource, real treasures. You know, in my book, Goats and Governors, I talk a lot about Big Jim. I wanted those stories saved. What's your first memories of Big Jim, and what's your favorite story about Big Jim?
Actually, I think Big Jim is the reason I wound up a reporter. My mother used to have a beauty shop over one of the banks on the courthouse square
in Andalusia.
And as a small child, she would take me with her to work when politicians were coming to town to speak on the courthouse square. And as a small child, I remember her taking me to see Big Jim Folsom speak, and he was on the back of a truck, and he had the strawberry pickers with him. And I remember I thoroughly enjoyed the music, and I remember the music more than him, but he got up there to speak, and I just remember he was up on the truck, so he was way taller than I was, just a little kid, and I remember just looking up at this giant, and he clearly entertained the crowd. I was too young to really understand what he was talking about, but you know, I grew up going to church every Sunday, and I was used to preachers standing behind a pulpit. And one of the things that struck me is he had no lectern or stand like a speaker.
That was when he struck with you.
It was just a microphone on a metal stand that he had stretched to its limit to be anywhere near his face, and this booming voice and this imposing presence, and it was just fascinating to me as a small child, this guy.
Most people knows how big his feet were.
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
He had a 17.5 shoe.
But when I came to Montgomery to work, he was still in good enough health that he would regularly come down to the legislature. And they were still in the old Capitol then, and he would sit in the rotunda in one of the chairs that were around the outside of the rotunda and visit with people. And I had several occasions to sit and talk with him in the rotunda, and he always brought up about how he didn't think lawyers should be in the legislature, that they were part of the judicial branch of government, they shouldn't be in the legislative branch. And everybody in the legislature either had on like dress shoes, and there were a couple who wore cowboy boots, but mostly dress shoes. But he always had on black, short, lace-up boots, what country folks call brogans, but they were like desert boots or chukka boots that people say down, except they were black and leather, and his pants, when he would sit down, his pants never would come down to his boots. He had always had this pale white shin showing above his socks, and he would hike his pants up even more. But he would tell great stories in the rotunda, and
he knew you were a reporter.
Oh yeah, and I enjoyed talking with him. But one of the first people I met when I came to Montgomery was his sister, Ruby.
Big Ruby.
And she, when he in his first term as governor, he was widowed when he went in at the office, and so she sort of served as mansion hostess initially for him until he remarried. People called her Big Ruby because she was big, tall, like her brother, and like her brother, she liked to have a drink.
Yeah.
When her health began to decline, she had a house in the Garden District here in Montgomery that was near the governor's, within walking distance of the governor's mansion. When her health began to decline, she decided she needed to move closer to her children, and she was having a big estate sale before she moved. And I thought, well, that'd make a good story because everybody knew Ruby. And so I called her and went over there, and this was after her daughter Cornelia had divorced Governor Wallace, and Cornelia met me at the door, and I spoke with her, and then I went in and interviewed Ruby and Cornelia about her plans and leaving Montgomery and all that. And then the estate sale started, and her house looked like the normal estate sale. Everything in it had a price tag on it, and on the dining room table she had a tablecloth on it that went all the way down to the floor, and she had china and dishes stacked all over the table except for one corner, and one corner had only a shot glass in it, a single shot glass. And people would come in for the estate sale, and she'd be showing them around, and she would say, "This was Big Jim's favorite shot glass." And people would pay Waterford Crystal price for a dime store shot glass, thinking it was Big Jim's favorite shot glass. And when they would leave, she'd lift that tablecloth up, reach in a box, grab another shot glass, set it on the table. More folks would come through. This was Big Jim's favorite shot glass. There are probably 100 people in Montgomery who have think they've got Big Jim's favorite shot glass, but I realized from reading your book that as much as he was known from drinking, he may have had lots of different favorite shot glasses. She may have been telling the truth. But she was just a delightful lady. She was as colorful as he was.
She's about 6 feet tall.
Yeah, she was
Big
very
Jim
tall.
was 6'9".
And
big old lady. She spent her last years at the nurse home in Troy. I'd go out and see her.
Yeah, she was
She
a
just
delight.
cussed like a sailor.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And she'd talk about old Big Jim, and she'd cuss everybody, and she'd shout out loud. But she was a real character. She saw those shot glasses. That was Big Jim's favorite shot glass. Phil, you were kind of young. Did you ever remember seeing him on TV drunk that night?
I was a child then, but I remember my father watching
Talking
that with my
about
father. Yeah, it was on WSFA here, and you addressed this, and your parents did the same thing. It was like, he's drunk, and calling the whole family together, because everybody had a great deal of respect for Governor Folsom, at least in our part of the state.
Yeah.
My grandmother voted for him every chance she got. She always said, Big Jim got us out of the mud. She was talking about his farm to market road, and that he paved the road where my grandparents lived, and they would do anything for Big Jim, because if you lived on a paved road, that was a big deal back then, and she always spoke kindly of Big Jim till she died. Because of that farm to market road program. So he was revered for helping rural people, but no matter how much you admired someone, you just didn't misbehave like that on TV. And I think it was just shock and disappointment.
But they could tell he was drunk.
Oh yeah, and But I remember sitting in the den watching that with
And
my
your parents
parents.
said he's drunk.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
At what point they figured out? Early on? Most people figured out early
Yeah,
on.
I think so. Yeah, and
My mama wouldn't admit it until he got doing the cuckoo bird thing.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
When he did the cuckoo bird thing for 7 minutes. Cuckoo, cuckoo. I said, Mama, I believe he's drunk. And she said, son, I believe you're right.
I had forgotten about that until I was reading in your book. But the thing I remember is where he couldn't remember his own child's name.
You remember that?
Yeah, that was.
That was an eye opener, wasn't it?
I was a child, and it was like, oh my goodness. He doesn't, and I didn't. I didn't remember that he had a whole flock of children. He had a big family. So if I had that many children, I might forget a name too. But as a child, that just flabbergasted me.
He's a good little boy. That's a good little boy. Boy, what is your name? He got Jim first. He said, this is a good little boy. He's my first little boy. He's a good boy. I like him. Come on, his name's Jim. The second one, Jack, he got looking at it. He's a good little boy, too. I like him. Well, what is your name?
But in later years, when I talked with Governor Big Jim Folsom, when he would be sitting in the rotunda visiting with folks, he always insisted that he was drugged.
I know it. He always said Wallace drugged him.
But he certainly had a delightful personality, and he was fortunate that his first term came when all the soldiers were coming home. They had money to spend, and the economy was on the upswing. And if you're going to be governor, you couldn't ask for a better time to serve as governor.
Big Jim, I got some stories from Little Jim, and you may remember them from the book, but you hit on something that I've seen year after year, time after time. Your grandparents and the whole state was like this, lived in the country, farmed for a living, and they had dirt roads and could not get their crops to the market. And they, it was just, to pave their road was a big thing. Big Jim paved every farm to market road in the state. That was his thing, to help the folks in the country. And Jim gave me this story, said he was campaigning for Congress early on one time against Henry Stigall before he actually moved to Coleman in the latter part of his life. And the first part of his life, he ran for Congress in the Wiregrass against Henry Stigall. He was campaigning down a country road in Geneva County. It was a dirt road, and he got to the end of that dirt road and just fell in love with this old farmer and his wife, and sat on their front porch and drank buttermilk with them all afternoon long. And they just, Big Jim took his shoes off and got barefooted and sat there with the old country couple. And the old farmer, after a while, says, boy, I tell you one thing, I'll just ask you this. If you ever get to be something, will you pave my road? Big Jim said, I sure will. Went on down, about 10 years later, Big Jim got elected governor. First foreign market road he paved was that road in Geneva County. Name it the Buttermilk Road. That's the name of it.
Yeah. That's a great story in your book. I enjoyed that one.
Every time I make a talk, I'll hear somebody, just what you just said about your grandparents. I have some old college come, if I'm speaking in Evergreen or Scottsboro, and I speak to a Rotary Club, and I'll tell them Big Jim stories, they'll come and say, let me tell you something, Flowers. If Big Jim was running for governor right now, I'd vote for him. I'm convinced that Little Jim won that race against Luther Strange for lieutenant governor about 12 or 16 years ago. Remember Luther Strange ran the first time for lieutenant governor as Republican, and Little Jim beat him by by a narrow margin because that ad with Luther was playing tennis at the Mountain Brook Country Club, and they put that ad with him playing, he was a member of Mountain Brook Country Club. But I swear I believe Big Jim won that race from the grave for him. Well, he had a career because of it.
Yes. Started off with PSC and lieutenant governor, and very, very interesting career.
Phil, you talk about that. You and I saw this because we were the same contemporaries with these young guys. But in that race we're talking about, Big Jim gave him on TV drunk in '62. The candidates were Big Jim Folsom, George Wallace, and Ryan DeGraff Reed. And about 20 years later, there was a lieutenant governor's race, and it was a race with Ryan DeGraff Reed Jr., Big Jim Folsom Jr., and George Wallace Jr.
That's right.
Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
I bet you wrote about it too, didn't
Yeah.
you? 20 years later, the 3 sons, and they all were there because of Dad's name, just name ID.
And
Jim Folsom won that race.
and he's very good with the crowd. He's very likable, very personable. He doesn't have his dad's flamboyant side.
Nobody has that.
He's way quieter than his father, but he has a way of making people feel comfortable around him.
Hey, no question. Let's talk a little bit about old Fob. What did you think about old Fob? He was an interesting guy, wasn't he?
I had covered Fob as a businessman with. He ran Diversified Products in Opelika, which at the time was a very big manufacturer.
I'm told it's the biggest employer in Lee County.
And he'd had a couple of expansions I'd covered and done stories on, and met him, and he was a very likable guy, but his PR person was a guy named Star Smith, and Star Smith called me and said, I want you to talk with Fob. He's thinking about running for governor. And so I went and with Star and talked with Fob and did an interview with him, and I thought, well, he's a real nice guy. He's a smart businessman, but you know, the 3 Bs were running, Brewer, Baxley, and Beasley, and everybody thought one of them would be the next governor. And then Fob hired Delos Walker from Memphis, who was a great campaign strategist, and he came up with several things to help Fob grab people's attention. The Road to Nowhere ad, and back then the Democratic primary was right after Labor Day, and I spent some time right before Labor Day and during Labor Day weekend traveling to campaign events all over the state. Back then, towns still had events where all the politicians came and spoke one right after another. Those have kind of disappeared, but they were fun to go to because you really got a sense of whose campaign was getting hot and whose campaign was cooling off. And I remember coming back to Montgomery after one of those road trips in August and telling some of the people around the Capitol, this guy Fob James is taking off. A lot of people are talking about him who are saying, well, I'm thinking about switching my vote. I like what he's saying. And people say, oh, no, it's going to be one of the 3 Bs. Well, sure enough, he was taking off. And Fob ended up winning. And I always thought Fob, people tend to remember some of the goofy stuff he did, like imitating an ape at a state school board meeting when they were talking about evolution. And he really did some stuff that the state got its first oil lease windfall from renting drilling sites off the Alabama coast for natural gas wells. And there was a lot of pressure in the legislature, as you will remember, to spend that money. And Fob said, no, we need to put it in a trust fund. And the voters approved it. And it was initially called the Heritage Trust Fund. It's now known as the Alabama Trust Fund. But he had to use every bit of political capital he had to keep that money from being spent and saving it. And
that's his legacy.
Yeah, and now that's over $2 billion. We got another oil lease windfall when Governor Wallace was in the next term. But the stage was already set. Wallace had to say, let's put it in a trust fund. But between those two oil lease windfalls going into savings, Alabama has a savings account that any state would be proud of, but Fob James set the stage for it.
That's Fob's legacy. Well, Phil, our time's up. I appreciate you being on for a second time. Folks, our guest tonight has been Phil Rawls, retired Association Press reporter for 35 and a half years. Thank you all for watching. Hope you'll tune in again next week for Alabama Politics.